Okay, so picking up on chapter 21, we're going to start talking about genetic diversity. So genetic diversity is the influences the process of natural selection. So remember, we go back, it is the arrow in blue here. So one of the ways genetic diversity will occur is from mutation. There can be different kinds, one of which is spontaneous mutation that are due to an agent, something that caused it. And it cannot be tied, and changes in DNA that cannot be tied to any particular agent. Cosmic radiation, mutagenic chemicals are examples of a causative agent. Spontaneous mutation is something that there's nothing that could have been done about. There's no reason for it to happen. It just happened randomly. Naturally occurring genetic mutation rates are really low, about 1 in 100,000, meaning that most of our genetic mutations there's a root cause for it. Now, there are possible outcomes when a gene is altered. One is that the mutation is so minor that it has no effect. You wouldn't even know you had it. The mutation could be harmful, either to the longevity of a species. Maybe the species doesn't come to full term to be born. There could be a physical mutation. The other one is the mutation could be beneficial. So not all mutations have to be bad. In order for mutations to be passed on to the next generation, though, they must happen in cells that become sex cells. So not all of your cells go on to become eggs and sperm, only a fraction of them do. And so the mutations won't pass on to your offspring unless the mutation itself is present in the sex cell. Now, genetic diversity also occurs just due to sexual reproduction. In asexual reproduction, there is not genetic diversity due to reproduction, only due to mutations. So in sexual reproduction, it's not generating new genetic information, but the genes are recombining into new mixtures because you get 23 from mom, 23 from dad. They're going to combine to 46 to become a unique set of individual genes. You may share some traits like mom and share some traits like dad, even share traits with siblings and grandparents, but your genes are completely unique. So acquired characteristics do not influence natural selection. They're not genetically determined, gained during life of organism, and cannot be passed on to other generations. So things you acquire are not going to be passed on. So let's talk about two different types of theories about why variation occurs. The first one is Lamarck's theory, which is that for example, with giraffes, over time, because of competition for food, the giraffes had to continue to eat leaves that were higher and higher and higher, and due to stretching, the neck becomes longer. And so this is a variation that is acquired because over time, the giraffe is going to stretch its neck out. And then when it reproduces, it's going to have an offspring that it has a longer neck because the giraffe here acquired a longer neck. Darwin and Wallace's theory was that there's two different sets of individuals. Some individuals happen to have longer necks. When they become adults, the giraffes with the longer necks are able to reach the resources at the top of the tree, whereas the shorter necks are not able to. Therefore, because either one, they reach full reproduction age or they are the more competitive species, they're going to reproduce and have offspring that have longer necks, which then continue on to have their own offspring with longer necks. And eventually we would see that the shorter necked giraffes would become a species that was no longer around. Okay, so in each generation, more giraffes would be born than the food supply could support. In each generation, some giraffes would inherit longer necks and some would inherit shorter necks. But all giraffes are competing for the same food resources. Therefore, the longer necked giraffes could obtain more food, have a higher survival rate, produce more offspring. So it's the fitness and the reproduction. As well, as a result, succeeding generations would show an increase in the neck length of a giraffe species. So processes that drive natural selection, so what causes this flow to start? There are selecting agents, which are specific environmental factors that favor and influence the likelihood that certain characteristics will be passed on. Differential survival is that some individuals possess characteristics enabling them to preferentially survive and pass on their genes. Differential reproductive rates are some organisms may be able to better utilize resources to produce more offspring, so larger litters. Differential mate selection. Some individuals possess characteristics enabling them to be more frequently chosen as mates. So this is size, aggressiveness, attractiveness. It's why male birds will have pretty colorful feathers and the female bird of that species will usually be brown and not colorful, because it's the male's job to attract the female for reproduction. So that's a differential in mate selection. The Hardy-Weinberg concept is that conditions are necessary for genetic makeup to remain constant. The mating must be completely random, mutations must not occur, migration of individual organisms into and out of the population must not occur, the population must be very large, all genes must have an equal chance of being passed on to the next generation, meaning there's no natural selection. Now, this concept allows us for comparisons of genes within a population to determine if genetic changes are occurring, and then comparing genes of two different populations to determine if there's similarities in their genetic makeup. The concept is an argument for evolution because most of these conditions cannot be met. We don't have a mutation-free population. Migration in and out of a population does occur. The populations aren't always very large, and the genes don't always have an equal chance of being passed on to the next generation. So, evidence for theory of evolution. Species and populations are changing genetically through mutations, adaptations, environmental changes, selective breeding, extinctions. But evolution occurs by small steps. It's not overnight. So all species use the same DNA code and amino acid building blocks. So we're all very similar when it comes to our genetic makeup. It's difficult to eliminate a structure that becomes part of a process controlled by genes. An example is an appendix. Closely related species have similar DNA and embryological development, so we know that the way embryos develop is very similar, even though we do turn out to look very different, not just humans, but like humans and primates and things like that, that embryologically we share a lot of similarities. Fossil records also show changes in kinds of organisms. Species appear and subsequently become extinct. And there's also new techniques and discoveries supporting evolution. Now, there are misconceptions about the theory of evolution. Evolution happened only in the past. Well, there's lots of evidence suggesting there's current genetic changes occurring. Evolution has a specific goal. Well, natural selection favors the organisms that best fit the current environment, but random events can also have a major influence on natural selection. Changes in the environment cause mutations that are needed for an organism to survive. Mutations are random events, not necessarily adaptive. Individual organisms evolve, and so individuals may adapt by changing behavior or physiology, but they cannot change their genes, so you're born with what you have. An existing species may have arisen from another present-day species. The species in question may have had a common ancestor. So what is a species? It's a population of organisms whose members have potential to interbreed naturally to produce fertile offspring, but do not interbreed with other groups. Populations that demonstrate gene flow between them. So what's a gene flow? It's the movement of genes from one generation to the next or one region to another, and the smallest irreversible step in the evolutionary process. So two key ideas in these definitions is that the species is a population of organisms, not individuals, and the offspring must be fertile. There's two different types of ways or concepts to identify species. The first is biological and the second is morphological. So biological is a species can be identified by their inability to interbreed. So if they can't interbreed, then that's one thing. But it's not a practical way to distinguish species. Morphological is a method of using physical characteristics to identify a species, and while it is useful, it's not always foolproof. So, it might be helpful to look at birds and birds. Different types of birds share similar features. So speciation, range is the geographical area over which a species is found. Speciation is the process of generating a new species. And there's some other important terms. Geographic isolation is the portion of a species becoming reproductively isolated from the rest of the gene pool by geographic change, so a new river, a new mountain, things like that. There's no gene flow occurring between the what two species were together. Geographical barrier is a geological feature that keeps portions of the species from exchanging genes. Reproductive isolation. Over a long period of time, accumulated genetic differences may result in regional populations of a subspecies. So here's an example of gene flow. So a horse and a donkey, when they breed, they can be mated. They produce what's called a mule. So the rule is it must be produced by a mating female horse with a male donkey mule, but the mule is sterile. Because the mule is sterile, the horse and the donkey are considered to be of a different species, even though they produce a mule, but because the mule is sterile, horse and donkey are separate species. So how do new species originate? Three-step process. Geographic isolation occurs. Selective agents favor specific valuable genetic combinations. The genetic differences become so great that reproduction between the two groups is impossible, and the populations become separate genetically. The process has occurred only if the gene flow between the isolated populations does not occur even after barriers are removed, and separation of species is just not enough to generate a new species. So here's an example of two different types of squirrel. You can see here the squirrels exist on over here by the Jacob Lake, and then you have your other ones over there by the Grand Canyon. So they're separated by a huge barrier known as the Grand Canyon. They are not going to interbreed with each other, even though they are two different types of squirrels, and they are near each other. They have a geographical barrier that over time helped these two species differentiate. But you can see similarities between them. The ears, the tail, most features that squirrels have look similar. And here's another example of a snail. So you have no barrier, one species. A barrier forms, separating them into two populations. The differences are so great that two species are now evident. So their shells look distinct. And when the barrier is removed, then they cannot interbreed. So the theory of natural selection as a mechanism for evolution was proposed by Darwin and Wallace in 1858, and it's based on the following assumptions. All organisms produce more offspring than can survive. No two organisms are exactly alike. Organisms are in a constant struggle for survival. Individuals that possess favorable characteristics for their environment have a higher rate of survival and produce more offspring. Favorable characteristics become more common in the species, and unfavorable characteristics will be lost over time. So it's not necessarily stating exactly how species came to be and how everything is interconnected, but it tells us how we might be related and how those changes came over time. But like with most things in science, we probably will never really know all of the answers and all of the ways in which these things occurred, and that's why they're theories. Remember, theories are things that when you can't go back and actually be present when it happened, therefore we'll never really know. So we use them as guiding principles to understand our world, but with the understanding that it may not always completely explain everything.